1944 dawned and the strain of near-constant operations was beginning to tell on the crew of Walker's ships. In the time since Starling had been commissioned, 2 officers had suffered what today would be classified as nervous breakdowns and been sent ashore as unfit for further sea service, and the ship's best gunner had snapped and gone literally mad while on leave. It was hoped that the Christmas of 1943 and start of 1944 would give everyone some much-needed breathing room. Their last voyages had accumulated much wear and tear to the ships, but such was Second Support Group's value that Sir Max Horton had cleared dry dock space for the entire group and put them at top priority for the Liverpool dockyards to make good. The ships would thus be patched up, structural weaknesses reinforced, and the very latest in anti-submarine warfare equipment was being hurriedly transported to Liverpool by any means necessary. Walker also provided his assessment of escort carriers on the Atlantic convoy runs. His opinion was that their utility was varied. On the north-south runs to and from the Mediterranean, they were invaluable, and in late spring, summer, and early autumn, they'd be extremely helpful on east-west convoys to and from the New World. But in winter, when the seas were stirred up and the weather was foul, their limited flying hours and the even more limited visibility made them something of a liability in his opinion. The ships were of course priority targets for the U-boats and forced an escort commander to leave several valuable ships to guard an asset which wasn't able to contribute except as a torpedo magnet most of the time. Apart from the limited flying time, the wintry storms of the Atlantic meant a submarine would have to be fully surfaced for a realistic chance of the aircraft spotting them. The murky waters would conceal a submarine at periscope depth, and you'd have to be incredibly lucky to spot just a periscope in the frothing waters. With that said, escort carriers not attached to convoys would be more useful in these months, since independently operating groups could seek slightly better weather and had more freedom of operation when it came to positioning their ships. Although confined to the local area around Liverpool by a security cordon imposed across the entire country in the run-up to D-Day, things were generally looking somewhat better for the convoys and their escorts as well as their crews. This was typified by an exchange over Christmas between one naval officer in London and a civilian friend he met at the pub. "How is the war at sea going?" asked the civilian. Being discreet, of course, the officer gave a non-committal reply. "There's no need to be quite so discreet," said the civilian. "I can tell you how it's going. My business is to assemble machines sent over from the United States. At the beginning of the year, I was practically at a stop. Since the summer, however, I've been working like a man caught in a flood." He, like many others, had been able to pierce the cloud of censorship simply by noting the massive upswing in cargoes, obviously from the US, which were making it through. Even the German HS-293 guided missiles that menaced the convoys travelling the Bay of Biscay had been somewhat countered by unusual roundabout means. Although signal jamming once they'd been launched did of course help, the other route was discovered thanks to the Canadian destroyer Athabaskan. It had been hit but not sunk by such a missile in the same attack that had sunk the Egret. But as it turned out, at least one sailor aboard, with a camera, had decided to spend what he must have thought were the last moments of his life photographing the missile as it came in. Luckily, he and his camera survived, and between the recovered wreckage and the photos, experts ashore managed to put together a rough idea of which parts went where. This in turn allowed them to identify which part of the missile contained the fuel. Thus, they could work out what kind of fuel it was by chemical analysis, and they passed this information over to the intelligence services. Those services then worked out which factories in Germany were likely to be the ones producing said rocket fuel and dispatched a series of bomber raids after the factories. These hampered fuel production and in turn limited the number of HS-293s that could be deployed, which of course meant jamming efforts were considerably easier since you only had to counter a few missiles instead of dozens and dozens. Also emerging from the strange warehouses into which Britain's back garden inventors had been moved and told that really they were in a giant and very well-equipped shed, were a series of other helpful weapons. An extremely large and streamlined depth charge capable of withstanding pressures 800 to 1,000 feet down could be used now to relatively rapidly attack U-boats operating at extreme depth. This was in fact an adaptation of the existing Mark X depth charge, which contained a rather colossal 2,000 pounds of TNT and was intended to be fired from a torpedo tube. The original Mark X was designed to sink slowly to give the escort an understandable chance to clear the blast zone. The new Mark X Star sank almost 4 times as fast to reach the depths before the U-boat could move off. As it turned out, the sheer weight of the weapon, massing about 1.3 tons, meant that only a very limited number of ships could use it though, and of course these had to be ships equipped with torpedo launchers. More universally useful was an adapted 4-inch armour-piercing round which had been configured to travel in a straight line for considerable distances underwater. This was intended, of course, for use in the near-universal 4-inch deck guns that were present on everything from corvettes to frigates, and even the secondary batteries of some cruisers, and would allow a ship to attack a submarine that was operating at periscope depth, or just below that, since the shell would be capable of hitting the submerged hull of the submarine and then punching a hole through it. The period of rest came to an end at the close of January 1944. Shortly before departing, a ceremony was held where the general chase signals and battle ensigns from Starling and Kite, as used in the action in the Bay of Biscay, were handed over to the town of Bootle, a town that was then part of, and now is entirely subsumed by, Liverpool, which had adopted 2nd Support Group as their own. The speeches were of course greatly flattering to Walker, describing him as the #1 U-boat killer. But Walker, in his acceptance speech, replied, "I do not think I am an ace U-boat killer. This kind of warfare is not the sort that has one man as its ace protagonist. Fighting U-boats is very much like playing football or any other sort of game. You have a team of 1,000 men, any one of whom can wreck the whole show if he doesn't do his job properly. Every man has his own job to do. I am merely at the head of the affair. So please don't call me U-boat killer #1. That formidable character is 1,000 British tars." On the 29th of January, 2nd Support Group sailed once more. This time the group's strength consisted of the Starling, Wild Goose, Magpie and Wren, with Kite joining up shortly thereafter. Walker's other son, Nicholas, had been assigned to HMS Woodcock, but was denied the chance to sail under his father's command when the ship was reassigned to the 7th Escort Group. Walker's command was ordered to rendezvous with 2 escort carriers, the Neyrana and Activity. Intelligence had discovered that no less than 3 wolf packs were being assembled to attack a major convoy due to pass through their hunting ground in mid to late February, and so naturally they'd sent their most lethal anti-submarine warfare assets to counter them. On the 31st, the 2nd was sailing toward the target area and conducting exercises aboard when Commander Weems, aboard Wild Goose, was informed of a sketchy echo that seemed to be trying to pass him to starboard, between Wild Goose and Magpie. A few moments was all it took to confirm the Aztec operator had found a U-boat that was trying to sneak through the escorts to target the escort carriers. Weems immediately ordered Wild Goose hard to starboard in pursuit and rang up full speed. He then hoisted the attack pennant and ordered the rest of the group informed. As his ship came about, he saw to his horror that Neyrana was just starting the next turn in her zigzag course, but this would unintentionally bring her directly into the German submarine's sights. He quickly flashed a message to the escort carrier to immediately turn hard to starboard to get away from the area, and then ordered depth charges dropped. They weren't anywhere near set up for an ideal attack yet, but he hoped that the sound of the explosions would spook the U-boat and throw it off, buying time for a more precise attack to be sorted out. Magpie had followed Wild Goose and delivered a second attack, but as expected, neither did any real damage. Kite, Wren, Woodpecker and Magpie were then ordered to screen the carriers, while Wild Goose and Starling settled in to hunt their unwelcome visitor. Walker, aware of the need to deal with this threat relatively swiftly, both for the sake of the carriers and to make the convoy rendezvous in time, stalked the U-boat with Wild Goose abeam. Working their way around into a tail chase position from which they calculated the speed of advance to be around 4 knots, they lost main Aztec contact at about 700 yards, indicating the submarine had gone quite deep. But Walker now had another toy to play with. Called a Q attachment, this was a development of the Type 144 Aztec set, and was essentially a small, short-range depth-sounding device, originally developed to help ships equipped with the Hedgehog forward-firing mortar system keep contact with submarines, but which had also been fitted to second support group sloops to help keep track of their targets until the last possible moment. Setting his depth charges for the new deep mode that he'd pressed for previously, Walker decided he would now cosplay as a pair of Lancaster bombers and ordered both ships to start firing and dropping depth charges in a series of relentless salvos, effectively carpet bombing the sea with several tons of explosive. Even the seasoned crew of Starling were somewhat surprised by the ruthless extermination their captain seemed to be bent on. 14 depth charges later, and there were 2 explosions. One was from a depth charge that had reached 700 feet in depth. There was a dull thud, and a small column of water, much of the energy having been absorbed by the intervening layers of ocean. But almost immediately thereafter, there was a much larger, much more violent explosion that exited the sea scarcely 10 yards off Starling's starboard bow. The ship shook as if she'd run aground. The men on deck watched with fascinated horror as a solid column of water soared well past the height of the bemused lookout near the top of the ship's mast, and then several dozen or possibly several hundred tons of water collapsed down onto Starling's deck. Exposed sailors grabbed whatever they could hold on to as all loose articles, including at least one depth charge, were hurled around, and then the lights died as the breakers in the power distribution room were tripped. A few moments later, and Starling seemed to bodily haul itself back up out of the water, foam and sea cascading down its sides. As it did so, the power came back on as Stoker Mockridge, in charge of the switchboard, picked himself up off the deck and reset all the breakers. The crews immediately got back to depth charging, and a few minutes later there was another unexpected underwater explosion, this one much deeper, and then 2 more. The sloops ceased their attack, and soon oil, wood, and other less pleasant debris began to surface. Whatever that initial massive explosion had been, and the jury's still out on that to this day, the last rumbles on the hydrophones signalled the end of the 10th patrol of U-592. Walker duly ordered the main brace spliced, and the second set off for their delayed rendezvous with convoy SL-147-MKS-38, a formation of no less than 81 ships made up of 2 separate convoys, one from Freetown on the west coast of Africa and the other from Gibraltar, which had combined for the last leg of heading to the UK. They already had an entire escort group, B3, in close support, which allowed Walker to deploy his ships somewhat more liberally. He decided to have his carriers and sloops operate at some distance independently during the day, which would allow the aircraft the greatest freedom to patrol, with the carriers heading for positions deep within the convoy at night, at which time the sloops would supplement the convoy's outer screen directly. Intercepted signals were dispatched to him by naval intelligence ashore, each one up to the number of U-boats facing the convoy. As it would eventually turn out, Walker and his small flotilla were facing off with no less than 26 of the Kriegsmarine's finest. The combined 2nd Support Group and B3 Escort Group mustered a total of 11 escorts, and 2 escort carriers between them to face off against them. On the night of the 7th of February, the attack began. Able seaman Wall, on the portside lookout position on the bridge of Wild Goose, spotted a U-boat a mile away, low on the surface. The ship immediately set a ramming course, but the submarine dived, and so the sloop immediately slowed to 7 knots, which was thought to be the threshold below which the German acoustic homing torpedoes would not lock on to the slowly rotating propellers. The ASDIC team fought to hold the contact as Wild Goose awaited further support. The submarine seemed to be trying something new, and soon able seaman Wall was shouting a contact again. Weems came out of the bridge to see a periscope looking at him a mere 20 feet away. Almost immediately a 20mm Oerlikon and some machine guns opened up, and sparks were seen to flash as some rounds impacted the periscope, which quickly vanished beneath the waves as the submarine vanished astern. By this time, Kite had arrived to take up Wild Goose's position in the screen, while Woodpecker and Starling offered more immediate support. Woodpecker got there first, and she and Wild Goose repeated the carpet bombing approach from a week earlier. With Starling standing off to guide their attacks, they were soon rewarded with the sounds of a U-boat desperately trying to blow its ballast tanks. Then 5 sequential thuds as one compartment after another failed under pressure. A bubble of water and debris marked the passing of U-762. Having regained their positions in the escort screen, a high-frequency direction finding fix was achieved on a U-boat about 10 miles ahead. Magpie and Kite were the closest and ordered to head off and investigate. Shortly after they departed, Wild Goose gained a radar contact on the other side of the convoy. With this one only a mile away, she immediately dropped to under 7 knots and then headed for the contact. This was a justified precaution as her star shell salvo showed a U-boat in the middle of diving, and moments later there was an explosion somewhat aft of the ship, a homing torpedo reaching the end of its run, unable to keep a lock on the now slow-moving Wild Goose. Starling then appeared, and the two sloops alternated trying to creep up on their prey, which, as you might have guessed already, was a sneaky and experienced type. Another homing torpedo exploded in Starling's wake, again unable to lock on to the slow-moving escorts. After another attack, oil was detected on the surface, but the sub was still moving, wounded but not dead. Then suddenly shouts came up from almost every man on deck. Walker spun around to see the wake of a torpedo running shallow at speed heading right for him. It seemed that their prey had decided that if homing torpedoes weren't going to work, they'd just have to try the old-fashioned way. At 7 knots, Starling was pretty much a sitting duck, and unless Walker could think of something in the next few seconds, the ship's illustrious career was about to meet a very abrupt end. But you'd never really want to bet against Johnnie Walker. Even as many of the crew were making for the opposite side of the ship to get some form of shelter from the inevitable impact, Walker's voice barked out, "Hard a port, stand by depth charges, shallow setting, fire!" The crew who were still at their stations at the launchers were stunned. At 7 knots, a shallow depth charge would be sure to blow the ship's stern off, but such was their trust in Walker that they did it anyway. A few moments later, and a close-coupled pair of massive explosions shook the ship as the portside turn was turned into more of a portside skid as the sloop was shoved bodily sideways. But as the water and debris sluiced away and the crew corralled errant depth charges shaken loose, they were amazed to find themselves still alive. Not wasting a moment, Walker ordered Starling and Wild Goose straight down the bearing of the torpedo, and after several more passes of depth charges, a single large underwater implosion heralded the end of U-734. Then it was off to help Kite and Magpie, who were having quite the adventure of their own. Kite had been leading Magpie toward their own contact when suddenly out of the mist came a U-boat speeding the other way. Kite immediately opened fire with guns, turned towards the sub, and dropped speed. The U-boat dived, and Kite immediately began launching depth charges, set shallow. Magpie was closing in, just in time to witness their compatriot vanish beneath a pall of water amidst a colossal explosion. It seemed that the homing torpedoes had finally claimed one of the second. But then, as the moments passed, the water column collapsed and the spray blew away to reveal Kite, quarter-deck plates buckled and depth charge rails bent, but still mostly there. Improbably, Kite had managed to unintentionally mimic Walker. The sole depth charge that she'd actually managed to get away seems to have physically hit the incoming homing torpedo, accounting for the single massive explosion instead of the overpressure-induced double explosion that had occurred near Starling. But it meant that Kite was alive and angry, and both she and Magpie doggedly pursued the contact for several more hours, although without success until 5 hours later, shortly after midnight, Starling showed up. By this point, the submarine was moving slowly at extreme depth and moving in line with the wind and sea, which made holding a contact very difficult. Kite had run herself down to 17 depth charges, and so she was sent back to the convoy, leaving Starling and Magpie to keep up the hunt. Then Walker, who was full of bright ideas that night, decided to invent an entirely new tactic. Magpie was the only ship in the group equipped with a Hedgehog launcher, which she'd already used once without effect. Now, Walker began ordering Magpie after the U-boat, using Starling's ASDIC contact like a giant voice-activated remote-control toy. He had the gun and bridge crews constantly reporting range and bearing to Magpie from Starling, and the ASDIC crew reporting the range and bearing of the contact from Starling. He declared that he would inform Magpie when to fire her Hedgehog based on a set of calculations that he was rapidly doing in his head. This caused a fair degree of laughter, according to those who were present, as the odds of getting a hit on a deep-running submarine based on orders from another ship seemed impossibly low. But the laughter died instantly when, seconds later, the distinct sounds of 2 direct Hedgehog hits were clearly heard. "I was highly tickled by this hedgehoggery," Walker would later write in his report. Then, determining that the submarine was probably a little bit distracted at this stage, he risked a high-speed run-in, lobbed the last of his depth charges into the sea, and was rewarded with the destruction of the 3rd U-boat of the night, U-238. Dawn rose with the crews triumphant, but somewhat shaken. They had had far too many close calls with torpedoes for anyone's tastes. Starling was completely out of depth charges, Kite, as we said, was already down to 17, and the others averaged around 60 each. The convoy, though, was able to continue unharmed. The Admiralty determined that 2nd Support Group had punched a hole clean through the U-boat line, and so, with their close escorts still in attendance and the escort carriers needed elsewhere, the 2nd parted company and headed over to convoy HX-277, where the Norwegian tanker Thorsholm was carrying a large number of depth charges on deck to act as a replenishment vessel for escorts. Being a tanker, they could also top up their fuel reserves. Wild Goose, Woodpecker and Magpie were the easiest to restock, and so they were sent out to help the nearby HX-278, whilst the other ships continued to rearm and refuel. Weems, aboard Wild Goose, made a contact trying to sneak up behind the convoy, and with nerves and fatigue still somewhat raw from their 36-hour hunting ordeal earlier, simply ordered all 3 of his ships to repeat the carpet bombing assault, now called plastering, after some time spent trying to pin down the elusive contact, thus sending U-424 to the bottom as several square miles of the Atlantic were comprehensively sanitized by explosives. Weems' crew now decided that they needed a banner, much like submarines had the Jolly Roger, to celebrate their success when they got back to harbour. They settled upon a large dark blue flag with the ship's crest in the middle, with kills marked by empty grog casks emblazoned on the top right of the flag, an acknowledgement of the splicing the main brace that was undertaken after each successful hunt. The 2nd then reassembled and headed out to escort convoy ON-224, which also had more depth charges for them. Although intelligence reported the area ahead full of U-boats, there were only a few fleeting contacts made, and so once the merchant ships were through the danger zone, Walker decided to double back to see if any subs were trying to follow them. The Admiralty ordered him to rejoin the convoy, but Walker decided that since there was a possible contact on his scopes, he was going to temporarily pretend he hadn't seen that particular signal, and instead ordered the pursuit. ASDIC conditions were awful, and attack after attack was made, but after 6 hours, apart from some very close detonations, nothing seemed to have happened, when suddenly the shape of U-264 breached the surface 1,700 yards away. The 2nd immediately turned towards the sub, slowed to 7 knots to evade any homing torpedoes, and opened fire. U-264 had actually, originally, been supporting the attack on the big convoy the 2nd had started off escorting, but it had gotten lost and wandered around the Atlantic hoping to find a target. Between a veteran captain and poor weather conditions, she'd avoided a death blow, but the cumulative effects of so many near misses had broken enough things that it was easier to just list what was still working, namely 1 propeller shaft and maybe some of the torpedo tubes. And even then the prop shaft was of questionable utility as the engines themselves had been bounced clean off their mountings. Realising that staying below would very soon result in their deaths to no real effect, as about the only other working system they had was the ballast tanks, and even then only just, Captain Lukes decided he'd had enough. He blew the tanks and upon surfacing ordered the crew to abandon ship. With the sub taking multiple impacts from the 2nd's guns, he saw his crew off, went back inside, set the scuttling charges, reappeared, saluted his command and dived overboard. U-264 sank beneath the waves for one last time, and Starling, Wild Goose and Woodpecker collected a rare prize, a complete U-boat crew as prisoners. Kite now reported engine problems and had to depart for Liverpool, But the rest of the group kept hunting. That evening, they started chasing a high-frequency direction-finding contact, but at last luck turned against them, as just after 10 p.m. a crash sounded from the direction that Woodpecker was supposed to be in. Shortly thereafter, several more explosions were heard. Then came a radio signal. Woodpecker had been hit by a homing torpedo fired from a submarine seconds after she'd spotted said submarine on Aztec. The other explosions were depth charges in her stern, as 40 feet of it was currently sinking to the depths of the ocean, and the fuses of the depth charges aboard that section had activated. The group formed a protective circle around Woodpecker, which was improbably still afloat. Starling pulled alongside to try and tow the stricken ship, only for the weather to shove the two ships together. Luckily, Woodpecker had been in the process of hanging out a sea boat on that side, and the poor boat took the brunt of the collision. One officer subsequently found Starling's carpenter slowly hauling the shattered boat's rudder off the deck towards his stash of spare parts. Eventually, after several parted lines, a tow was established, and the majority of Woodpecker's crew was evacuated to other ships. The next day, the wonderfully named tug Storm King arrived, and with thicker hawsers was able to take over the job. Unfortunately, as the rest of the group headed for Liverpool, the weather continued to build, and Woodpecker eventually had to be abandoned. Storm King cast off lines at the very last moment, and the battered sloop slipped beneath the waves. A victim at this last more of the weather than of the initial damage itself, which had been survivable. Luckily, everybody involved managed to make it off safely. For the 4 ships left in Walker's group, there was a grand reception. They'd sunk 6 U-boats, broken the back of a mass wolfpack attack, and gotten their convoys through without loss. They were thus greeted by cheering crowds, the First Lord of the Admiralty himself, and a full salute from the crew of the carrier HMS Victorious. The main thing for Walker was they'd managed to get in 2 days before his silver wedding anniversary, which the officers and men conspired to make somewhat memorable by secretly organising a large party for the couple. The sloops went in to refit and rearm. HMS Wimbrel was assigned to make up for the loss of Woodpecker, and Walker was informed he was being awarded his 3rd Distinguished Service Order. But of more importance to him was the fact the Admiralty had also decided to backdate his seniority as captain by 2 years, effectively erasing the black mark of being passed over for command back in the 1930s. But there was still a war to be fought, and soon the second was back out at sea, this time with the escort carrier Vindex on a specific mission to hunt down U-boats in the mid-Atlantic which were being used as mobile weather stations by the Kriegsmarine. Due to having to surface fairly often and then make long transmissions, the subs were relatively easy to fix via high-frequency direction finding, and with an aircraft from Vindex confirming the fix with the visual sighting, U-653 was destroyed with a single pass of depth charges from Starling. This pinpoint attack completed, the group was ordered back, not to Liverpool, but to Scapa Flow, the base of the home fleet. The ship's log recorded the anniversary of Starling entering service thusly. In the past year, Starling has steamed 47,369 miles. The screw have turned 40 million times, the ship's company has been paid £16,000, and 25% of which has been spent in the canteen. 2,940,000 cigarettes have been smoked, an average of about 35 per man per day. £1,016, 13 shillings and 3pence has changed hands at Tombola. The officers and men have received 13 decorations, 12 mentions in dispatches, 11 commanders-in-chief's commendations, and 447 gallons of rum has been drunk. There's a lot of wear and tear on the main brace as it has been spliced 9 times. Starling has used 3,919 tons of oil fuel, and the officers of the watch have drunk 4,320 cups of cocoa. When the second arrived in Scapa, they found consignments of winter clothing waiting. They were to be sent as part of the escort for Arctic convoy JW-58, with Walker placed in charge of all small ship escorts. Great amusement was had when it was realised that Walker's backdated seniority meant that he was now actually senior to most of the captains in the home fleet's capital ships, which all duly had to turn out a guard and offer a salute whenever the diminutive starling happened to wander past. This convoy would include the escort carriers Activity and Tracker, which the second had sailed with before, and the Omaha-class cruiser USS Milwaukee, which was on its way to become the Russian cruiser Murmansk. At just over 50 ships strong, the convoy was large and important, hence the heavy escort. On the evening of the 30th of March, an ASDIC contact was made and Starling and Magpie moved to intercept. The submarine seemed to show no sign of awareness of the escorts until depth charges started raining down. Then there was the sound of tanks blowing, but it seemed that the damage was sending water into the sub faster than the tanks could be emptied, and shortly thereafter a patch of oil and wreckage marked the passing of U-961, which records show was newly commissioned and on its way to the Atlantic, and thus likely had no idea of the convoy it had just stumbled into the path of. The weather closed in, and soon the crew were reduced to holding megaphones up to their eyes the wrong way around to try and save their faces from the bombardments of large hailstones whilst they kept watch. The fleet air-arm pilots from the escort carriers kept up a constant patrol to see off various shadowing aircraft, and between the terrible weather, which meant terrible ASDIC conditions, the constant aircraft patrols keeping the submarines' heads down, and the quick responses of the escorts to any spotted submarines on the surface, no major attack developed, although there were plenty of intercepted radio transmissions from nearby U-boats who were pondering how to get close to the convoy. A few skirmishes led to nothing much other than a couple of homing torpedoes which failed to hit Starling. One of the other escort groups managed to sink U-360 on the other side of the convoy, and Starling and Magpie felt a little bit cheated when they found themselves chasing a U-boat that they'd caught on the surface, only for aircraft from the escort carriers to overhaul them and then happily blast U-288 clean out of the water. All things considered, the convoy arrived at Murmansk without loss, with Starling's officers celebrating by trying to outdrink the Russian harbour pilot that they'd been assigned, which they just about managed, although they did have to fall back on the cheap port that they kept around for cooking purposes, having exhausted the gin, the whiskey, and the rum that were all in the mess. The return voyage, with convoy RA-58, went by without much incident, although this was largely thanks to a combination of weather and ice making ASDIC conditions pretty much impossible, and the fleet air-arm aircraft from Tracker keeping any U-boats' heads down which tried to spot things on the surface. The rough conditions, with all the ice making loud grinding noises, appeared to make the U-boats' hydrophones equally pointless when it came to trying to track down targets. After a couple of days in Liverpool, the second were back out at sea again along with Tracker, this time homing in on the stricken USS Donnell, a Buckley-class destroyer escort which had gotten the short end of the stick in a battle with U-473, having its stern blown off for its troubles. Wimbrel and Magpie were sent to help out the stricken American ship, while the others joined the frigates Bentley and Gore in the hunt for the sub. As it was 200 miles from their initial position to the Donnell, by the time they arrived, working out just exactly where the submarine had gone was anyone's guess. A wise submarine commander would have just sailed off, but it seems the sub had decided to hang around, and a high-frequency direction-finding fix scarcely 36 miles from the Donnell was made. But although the sub was picked up on ASDIC, it proved incredibly elusive. A 15-hour hunt in which almost 350 depth charges were expended then followed. But Walker had one thing on his side which even the slipperiest of U-boat captains did not: oxygen. The sub had run exceptionally deep, beyond the reach of even the newer depth charges that could get down to 700 or even 800 feet, hence the relative lack of damage to the sub, but eventually batteries and oxygen both began to run dry, and just after midnight in the small hours of May the 6th, the submarine was forced to surface. A gun battle then ensued. A flurry of homing torpedoes failed to track the sloops, which had immediately dropped speed, and the U-boat was eventually sent to the bottom by gunfire, taking about half the crew with it. Some controversy remains over its last actions. What is known is that the sub proceeded at speed and almost rammed Starling, which dodged at the last minute. What is in question is if this was a deliberate or an accidental act, as at some point in this stage of the battle, gunfire from the sloops killed everyone commanding the sub, but whether this occurred before, during, or after the close pass remains unknown. The survivors confirmed that the sub had indeed been running at below 850 feet, and the depth charges hadn't been inaccurate, just unable to sink far enough. The group set out for home, arriving on the 27th of May. Both Admiral Horton and Walker's wife Eileen could now see the physical evidence of the stress the last few months had imposed, and despite Walker's protests, he was told in no uncertain terms that he was due for 2 months of proper rest as soon as the D-Day landings had succeeded. He'd been earmarked for flag rank, a knighthood, and command of a carrier task force in the Pacific, which was essentially the fast-tracked promotion. But all that was supposed to be for the future. For now, the second was being pivoted towards operations closer to the European shore. To this end, the Dream Team was unfortunately to be split up. The sloops were held to lack sufficient anti-aircraft guns to be considered survivable too close to the attentions of the Luftwaffe's fighter bombers, and so Woodcock, Magpie and Wimbrel were detached to form the core of a new group, with their places in the second taken by the frigates Lochkillen, Lochfada and Dominica, which carried a much heavier anti-aircraft battery. This altered second support group went out for new drills where British aircraft submarines and MTBs did their best to replicate what they might expect to face in the Channel. The U-boats themselves were also at something of a lull, having been recalled in the most part to be retrofitted with schnorkels and to help build up their numbers alongside numerous midget submarines for coastal defence, and the Electra boats, which were expected to enter service later in the year. Walker was now placed in overall authority over 40 anti-submarine warfare vessels, including, of course, Second Support Group, and their job was now to guard the Channel against an expected surge of U-boats from the French Atlantic harbours. This wasn't a misplaced fear. Dozens of U-boats would make the attempt to enter the Channel and interdict the anticipated Allied landings, but the massed skirmish lines of Walker's escorts and the dozens of circling aircraft put paid to many of them. Unfortunately, it was exactly the wrong job to hand to a man who was already on the edge of exhaustion. Walker was now having to coordinate multiple escort groups, deal with various aircraft patrols, manage hundreds of sighting reports, most of which were simply over-enthusiastic mistakes, but which had a core of actual threats to them, and even when the second was able to briefly make port, the endless list of questions and problems from his wider command presented themselves. It was, for all that, an effective effort. The landings proceeded, and no U-boat managed to achieve anything against the landing forces until 11 days after D-Day itself, and even then the results were pretty minimal. With the landings successful, the second was recalled to Liverpool, arriving on the 2nd of July, where Walker learned that he was to be given a 4th Distinguished Service Order. A brief period of leave was also granted, but on the 7th Walker was handed 2 signals. The first of which was formal confirmation of the loss of HMS Parthian almost a year earlier, and thus also formal confirmation of the death of his son Timothy. The other was an order to sail the next day. That evening, on the way back from a movie, Walker began to complain of giddiness and humming noises in his head, and soon he was rushed off to the Royal Navy Hospital in Seaforth. But unfortunately, there was little they could do. In modern medical terms, Captain Walker had suffered a massive stroke or brain hemorrhage, no doubt brought on by the stress of the last couple of months of near-constant operations to secure the D-Day beaches from underwater attack, and perhaps tipped over the edge by the 2 telegrams. At 2 a.m. in the morning of the 9th of July 1944, he passed away. Second Support Group had sailed and were entering the Channel when they received an Admiralty signal. The Admiralty regrets to inform you of the death of your senior officer, Captain F. J. Walker, which took place at 0200 today. Such was the impact and renown of Captain Walker that the next signal was from Admiral Stark of the US Navy. The United States forces in Europe wished to convey their deepest sympathy in the loss of an outstanding fighting naval officer in the untimely death of Captain Walker. Although his loss will be keenly felt by all the Allied forces everywhere, his fighting spirit will endure with us. On the 12th of July, his funeral was held in a packed cathedral, amidst a sea of tributes from ports, convoy captains, Allied officers, ships' companies, shipping companies, and countless individuals who all owed a great debt to him. His coffin was then conducted to the destroyer Hesperus, which stood out to sea as every ship in harbour, as well as 2 convoys at the entrance, one leaving and the other entering, lowered their ensigns and turned out their crews. Just beyond the Bar light vessel, the coffin was committed to the deep, and Captain Frederick John Walker was finally at rest.